In the heart of a quiet town where laughter once echoed through schoolyards and innocence painted the air, an event occurred that silenced an entire community. 17 children, bright, playful, and full of promise, vanished in a single, dreadful act that questioned the very nature of humanity. This wasn't just a crime, it was a reflection of something deeper, something broken in society itself. To understand this chilling event, we must look beyond the horror and confront the roots of what led to it. Every dark story has its roots, not in sudden rage, but in long-forgotten wounds. When we trace the path that led to the kidnapping of 17 innocent children, we don't just uncover the actions of one person. We uncover the quiet failures of an entire system. Desperation is not born in a single day. It grows in the cracks of society, watered by neglect and hardened by indifference. In every city, every town, there are those who walk unseen. They live among us, carrying the weight of rejection, poverty, and despair. They are the unheard voices, the broken spirits who once reached out for help but found only silence. When the world closes its doors on such souls, something inside them begins to die. And in that emptiness, darkness finds a home. The man who took 17 children was not simply a criminal. He was a product of a world that stopped caring. From his earliest years, he faced humiliation instead of hope, isolation instead of understanding. Society labeled him, judged him, and then abandoned him to his own bitterness. Over time, that bitterness grew into rage, a silent fire burning behind a quiet face. When a person feels invisible for too long, they start to believe the only way to be seen is through destruction. And so, the unthinkable happened. What began as pain turned into punishment. Punishment for a society that had turned its back. Those 17 children became unwilling symbols in a desperate attempt to make the world notice what it had ignored for years. But let us not mistake understanding for forgiveness. No reason can justify what was done. Yet, to truly prevent history from repeating, we must see beyond the act and into its roots. Neglect is not just a failure of empathy. It is the seed of catastrophe. When compassion dies, cruelty is born. Every neglected child, every broken adult, every unheard cry becomes a potential tragedy waiting to unfold. The cost of ignoring suffering is not measured in statistics. It's measured in lives shattered, families destroyed, and innocence lost. The kidnapping of 17 children was not an isolated event. It was the final cry of someone shaped by years of emotional starvation. If the world had reached out earlier, if a helping hand had replaced humiliation, perhaps those children would never have known fear. Perhaps the man who became a monster could have remained human. Society often believes that punishment alone brings justice. But true justice begins when we heal the wounds that create such monsters in the first place. Desperation born from neglect is humanity's silent kill. It does not shout, it whispers. It hides in loneliness and poverty and forgotten homes. And until we learn to listen, to see the invisible and care for the unseen, we will continue to write stories like this one, again and again, in the blood and tears of the innocent. Civilizations rise not on stone or steel, but on moral foundations. When those foundations crack, no wall can stand strong for long. The tragedy of 17 kidnapped children was not only the act of one man, it was a warning, a reflection of how far humanity can fall when moral boundaries begin to fade. Once morality was a compass guiding every heart, every home, every decision. People knew the line between right and wrong, between love and cruelty. But as generations moved forward chasing power, wealth, and convenience, that sacred line began to blur. The world became louder, faster, colder. Compassion turned into weakness, and empathy was dismissed as distraction. In such an environment, even the most monstrous deeds can begin to seem explainable. The man who crossed the ultimate line did not wake up one morning as evil. His heart decayed slowly, corroded by a lifetime of rejection and hopelessness. Each betrayal, each failure, each moment of being unseen stripped away another layer of conscience, until the boundary that once separated light from darkness disappeared completely. He stopped seeing children as lives. He began to see them as tools to express his fury at a world that never cared. When moral boundaries decay, the human heart loses its anchor. People begin to justify the unjustifiable. The mind, detached from empathy, becomes capable of anything. This decay does not begin in prisons or back alleys. It begins in the silence of everyday life. when lies replace truth, when cruelty is ignored, when violence becomes entertainment. The kidnapping of those 17 children was not just a criminal act, it was a mirror reflecting what happens when morality becomes optional. It showed that evil does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers through indifference. A society that forgets its moral duties slowly breeds the very monsters it fears. And when the line between justice and vengeance, right and wrong, becomes foggy, even good people begin to lose their way. History has shown this pattern before. From wars to massacres, every tragedy begins with one small compromise of conscience, a lie tolerated, a cruelty overlooked, a voice silenced, and soon darkness spreads like a disease. The decay of moral boundaries is not just the failure of one person. It is the collapse of collective responsibility. What happened to those children is not only a question of how evil one person could become, it's also a question of how a society could drift so far from its own humanity. It reminds us that morality must be guarded fiercely, not just by laws, but by hearts. Because once moral boundaries fade, there is no map back to innocence. The moment right and wrong lose meaning, every soul becomes vulnerable to corruption. The story of those 17 children is therefore not only a tragedy of crime, it is a moral wake-up call for all. When a society stops protecting its conscience, it starts paving the road toward its own destruction. Every act of defiance begins with a sense of injustice. Some cry out with words, others through rebellion, and a few, lost in the shadows of their pain, and choose destruction as their voice. The kidnapping of 17 innocent children was not merely a crime of cruelty. It was a distorted, tragic outcry against a system that had long turned its back on those it was meant to protect. For years, the man who committed this horrifying act had been shaped by a society that spoke of justice but rarely practiced it. He lived under a system that rewarded the powerful and punished the powerless. Each attempt to rise was met with resistance, each cry for help buried under bureaucracy and indifference. He saw the world as divided, those who rule and those who are ruled. And as he stood on the losing side of that divide, bitterness became his only companion. In his fractured mind, the kidnapping became a statement, a twisted form of protest. It was as if he wanted to shout to the world, "And now you will feel the pain I've lived with my entire life." It was not justice he sought, but recognition. He wanted the powerful to tremble, to experience fear, to finally notice the suffering that had been ignored for far too long. History tells us that revolts are often born in silence. When people are silenced by injustice, they search for ways, any ways, to be heard. And when reason fails, desperation takes its place. This tragedy was not just a personal crime. It was a symbolic rebellion born from decades of systemic failure. A life crushed by inequality, denied dignity, and stripped of hope eventually lashes out. Not always at those responsible, but at those who are innocent and near. But here lies the darkest truth. Injustice breeds monsters. When institutions fail to protect fairness, they indirectly nurture the very evil they fear. Each ignored plea, each unfair verdict, each corrupt act becomes fuel for future chaos. The world often forgets that tyranny does not only exist in governments, it exists in workplaces, in families, in social hierarchies where one's pain is dismissed as weakness. Those 17 children became unwilling participants in one man's war against the world. He saw them not as victims, but as messengers, symbols meant to expose what he perceived as a broken order. Yet in trying to punish power, he inflicted horror upon innocence, proving that vengeance can never bring justice. It only multiplies pain. This event reminds us of an uncomfortable truth, that when injustice remains unchallenged, it evolves into rage. And when rage is ignored, it explodes into tragedy. The real question then is not why he did it, but why he felt that was the only way left to be heard. The kidnapping of 17 children was a cry, a desperate, violent cry against power, corruption, and silence. And while the act was unforgivable, its roots must not be forgotten. For if injustice continues to thrive, others too will hear that same call in the dark, and history will repeat itself once more. The human mind is both the most powerful and the most fragile creation on Earth. It can build civilizations, shape empires, and uncover the mysteries of the universe. Yet it can also collapse under the weight of its own pain. The kidnapping of 17 innocent children was not only an act of evil, it was also a tragic reminder of what happens when the delicate balance of the human mind is shattered beyond repair. Every person walks a thin line between sanity and chaos. For some, that line is strengthened by love, support, and understanding. For others, it is constantly eroded by rejection, trauma, and isolation. The man behind this horrific event had spent years walking that fragile edge, slowly losing touch with reason, compassion, and reality itself. Each disappointment, each humiliation, each sleepless night of regret chipped away at the walls of his sanity, until they finally crumbled. Mental decay rarely announces itself with noise. It begins in silence, a quiet storm brewing within. The mind starts to twist memories, distort truths, and blur the difference between friend and enemy. What was once empathy turns into suspicion. What was once love becomes resentment. And in that distortion, even the most horrifying ideas can begin to make sense. He convinced himself that his suffering gave him the right to inflict pain on others. He built a world in his head where he was the victim, the hero, and the judge, all at once. This is the true tragedy of a broken mind. It does not know it is broken. It believes it sees clearly while standing in complete darkness. Yet society's role cannot be ignored. How many warnings went unnoticed? How many times did he cry out for help, only to be silenced or mocked? In a world where mental health remains a stigma rather than a priority, countless minds break in secret. They walk among us, smiling, working, blending in, until one day, something inside them snaps and the world is left asking why no one saw it coming. The kidnapping of 17 children was the explosion of years of internal chaos, a madness born not from sudden rage, but from long-term psychological decay. It was the moment when the fragile mind, left untreated and unheard, chose destruction as its final expression. We often speak of crimes and punishment, but rarely of prevention. True prevention begins not in prisons or courts, but in the quiet corners of the human heart, in understanding, in compassion, in care. The fragility of the human mind should not be seen as weakness, but as a warning. Just as a cracked mirror distorts every reflection, a damaged mind distorts reality itself. If we ignore the pain of the broken, we risk breeding the tragedies of tomorrow. The human mind, once lost, can destroy everything around it, including innocence. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. The greatest dangers are not always external. They live within us, waiting for silence to give them power. When tragedy strikes, it leaves behind more than grief. It leaves lessons carved in sorrow, written in tears, and remembered in silence. The story of the 17 kidnapped children is not just a headline from the past. It is a mirror reflecting everything that went wrong in our humanity. It forces us to confront questions we would rather avoid, questions about compassion, morality, and the world we have created through our indifference. In the aftermath of that unspeakable act, the world stood still. Parents cried, communities mourned, and nations watched in disbelief. But beyond the grief lay a deeper realization. That evil does not appear out of nowhere. It grows quietly in the soil of neglect, watered by injustice, and fed by the world's silence. Every tear shed for those innocent lives is a reminder that pain ignored today becomes tragedy tomorrow. The lesson written here is not only about crime, it is about responsibility. The responsibility each of us holds toward one another. When we fail to listen to the cries of the broken, when we mock the weak or turn away from the suffering, we unknowingly shape the very darkness we fear. Those 17 children paid the price for wounds they never caused, and that is the greatest injustice of all. History has always been a teacher, though its lessons are often cruel. It reminds us that humanity's downfall begins not with violence, but with apathy. When love becomes rare and empathy fades, when truth is twisted and justice becomes selective, the seeds of horror begin to grow. What happened in that quiet town was not just the result of one man's madness, but the reflection of a collective failure to care. But even in despair, there is hope. For every tear that falls in mourning, a new promise can rise to do better, to see deeper, to love more fiercely. The tragedy of those 17 lives can become a turning point if the world chooses to learn rather than forget. Because forgetting would mean allowing history to repeat itself in another place, another time, with different faces but the same mistakes. The lesson is clear. Empathy is not weakness. It is survival. A society that loses compassion loses its humanity. We cannot undo what happened, but we can honor those children by ensuring their story awakens the conscience of generations to come. Their memory stands as a warning etched in sorrow that the cost of indifference is far greater than the effort of care. That the silence of the good can be as destructive as the actions of the wicked, so let these tears not fall in vain. Let them be ink for a new chapter, one where children can grow without fear, where justice protects the weak, and where no one feels so abandoned that they must destroy to be seen.